If you enjoy these videos, I'd love it if you'd become a part of my Patreon community. The link to find out more about that is just below this video. 3 Celtic horse goddesses, Epona, Rhiannon, and Macha. What's the difference? Let's start with some facts about each goddess, and by facts I mean things we can definitely know, like physical artifacts or written evidence. Epona was worshipped by the Celts or Gauls in Roman times, both in continental Europe and Britain. Her worship was adopted by the Roman cavalry, some of whom were Celts, and so she became widely known even in Rome itself. This interest by the Romans is the reason for there being so many statues and inscriptions to Epona. The name Epona can be broken down into ep or epo, meaning a horse, on, meaning divine or godlike, and the feminine a ending. So Epona could be translated as divine mare or horse goddess. Whatever myths the Gaulish Celts had about Epona have been lost. So we're lucky to have so much physical evidence. Many of the carvings of her are very beautiful, although it's fair to say that the style is Roman, or Roman influenced. The Celts themselves didn't go in for beautiful, naturalistic representations of deities, as far as we know. It's been suggested that representations like the Uffington horse hill figure, or the horses sometimes with female riders found on some Celtic coins, might be a more typical Celtic expression of the idea of Epona, but we don't know that for sure. The depictions we have that are definitely Epona always show her with horses, foals, or mules. She often holds fruit, or grain, or bread, and sometimes she is surrounded by many animals. She always looks gentle, peaceful, and kind, but this may have more to do with the Roman ideals of womanhood than with the Celtic perception of Epona. This is a problem with studying her. We tend to get the Roman side of the story. Many of the inscriptions to Epona are from Roman military settings and mostly tell us that the person who paid for the inscription did so in fulfillment of a vow. So perhaps a soldier had made a vow that if he was successful in battle or survived or something like that, then he would pay for a public inscription, perhaps in a temple. Some of the magnificent relief carvings of Epona are from temples, but there are also many smaller portable ones which could probably be purchased to put on a home altar. Again, these practices may be more Roman than Celtic. We know from 2nd century Roman writers that votive figures of Epona were found in stables. One is mentioned as being garlanded with roses. Even as late as the 5th century, Christian clerics in far-flung places like North Africa complained that people were still worshipping Epona. Another horse goddess is Rhiannon. We know her only from myth. She is a leading character in the Welsh cycle called The Four Branches of the Mabinogi. Her stories are set in Dyfed in South Wales. Rhiannon's name can be understood this way. In Older Welsh, Rhian means a queen or a lady, and again the on ending indicates someone who is divine or otherworldly. So Rhiannon means something like divine queen. In the Mabinogi, Rhiannon first appears in the kingdom of Dyfed. She is beautiful, beautifully dressed, and riding a lovely white horse. Although this horse only appears to be moving at a walk, no runner or rider is able to catch up with her, but eventually Pwyll, the ruler of Dyfed, calls out to her and she stops and speaks with him. She tells him that she has come to marry him, and he agrees. Their wedding feast is marred by a quarrel when Pwyll says something foolish to Rhiannon's previous suitor, a man called Gwal. The wedding has to be postponed and can only go ahead after Rhiannon uses some magical trickery to solve the problems caused by Pwyll's careless words. Unfortunately, the tricks go a little too far, humiliating and threatening Gwal. Finally, Rhiannon and Pwyll seem set for a happy life when Rhiannon gives birth to their first son. Unfortunately, he disappears on the night of his birth, and Rhiannon is framed for killing and eating him. Puig doesn't seem to quite believe this, but his advisors pressure him into punishing Rhiannon. So he makes her sit by the castle's horse-mounting block and offer to carry visitors on her back as if she is a horse. Through strange circumstances, Rhiannon's son turns up alive in another part of the country. There, a man called Rhiannon is sitting with his mare who is about to foal. It seems that her previous foals have mysteriously disappeared, and he doesn't want that to happen again. As the foal is born, a monstrous clawed arm reaches through the window, trying to grab the foal, but Rhiannon draws his sword and cuts the arm off. He then runs outside to see the monster, but finds nothing. When he returns to the house, he finds a baby in the doorway. Rhiannon and his wife begin raising the boy, who has a great love of horses, and in time they realize who he is and return him to his parents. Later in the Mabinogi, we hear more about Rhiannon. This time, Puig has died and her son Pryderi rules Dyfed. He suggests that she marry Manawydan and hands Dyfed to them to rule, as by this time he has other lands. However, these three characters, together with Pryderi's wife, end up in a long adventure when the kingdom of Dyfed disappears in a mysterious mist. Manawydan eventually saves the day, rescuing Rhiannon from a prison where she has been made to wear a donkey's collar. It turns out that all their troubles came about because someone was avenging Gwaul's humiliation at Rhiannon and Puig's wedding feast. That's a lot to take in, I know, but there is a more detailed version of the story in a set of videos about Rhiannon here on my channel if you'd like to watch them. Or you could just read the Mabinogi. Finally, let's take a look at Macha. Like Rhiannon, we know Macha from her stories, this time in the north of Ireland. This gets a little tricky because there are a number of Machas in Irish myth, and whether they all represent the same goddess or not is unclear. The name Macha refers to a plain, a flat, open piece of land. Over time, the meaning seems to have shifted toward land enclosed for grazing, something more like a field, paddock, or even a milking yard. All the different stories about Macha have something to do with land, whether she's laying claim to it or clearing it for agriculture. I'm going to focus now on the Macha who is associated with horses. This Macha appears mysteriously one day at the house of a wealthy cattle lord called Cruinniuc, who's a widower with several sons. Without a word, Macha begins cooking and sweeping and doing the milking as if she'd always been there. At night, she went to Cruinniuc's bed, and before long, she was pregnant. One day, Cruinniuc decided to go to the fair held by the king, Conor. As he was getting ready to leave, Macha told him not to mention her at the fair, because it would bring trouble. So Cruinniuc went to the fair, and there was horse racing, and apparently he wasn't too impressed with Conor's horses, because Cruinniuc boasted out loud that his wife could outrun them. Conor took insult at this and said that unless the claim could be proven, he would have Cruinniuc killed. So Macha was brought to the fair in spite of her complaints that she had gone into labour. She found herself standing before the crowd at the fair. All Conor's warband were there, and she begged for mercy. She begged to be allowed to give birth with dignity before she had to run the race. The king and his men looked on, and no one spoke to help her. The horses were brought, and Macha raced against them to save Cruinniuc's life. She won the race. As she crossed the finishing line, Macha gave birth to twins in front of everyone. When this was over, she stood up and announced that she was Macha, and then she put a curse on the men of Ulster who had not helped her that day. It was a very fitting curse too, for she decreed that if they were needed to fight in battle, they would be taken with labour pains like those of a woman and be unable to fight. The story goes that this is why the former royal site at Armagh is called Eoghan Macha. It means Macha's twins. People often ask whether these three goddesses are not really just the same goddess by a different name. I guess that really depends on your view of theology. So far in this video, I've been careful to stick to the facts of how the medieval sources report the myths of Rhiannon and Macha. Those things are objective. But since we all have our own beliefs or personal experiences with deities, this next part has to be partly opinion. I've always been what people call a hard polytheist. That means I believe that deities are real, and that each deity is a separate entity, not part of some bigger mega-goddess or part of an archetype. If you disagree, that's okay, and you still might find some of this interesting. I definitely see these three goddesses as separate entities. I have a relationship with each of them, but each relationship feels slightly different. However, that said, I think that they are sympathetic to one another, kind of like they're friends. But let me try to compare them for you as objectively as I can. Although we have all this concrete evidence for Epona, in some ways I find her the hardest to get a handle on. All we really have are all these pictures of her looking very meek and mild, hanging out with horses. If those wild female riders on the coins do represent Epona, and we can't be sure that they do, then this might relate to a more warlike goddess, such as the Morrigan. The reason I mention the Morrigan here is because Macha is often said to be one of the three aspects of the Morrigan in her triple form. So hold that thought. Yet although Epona is venerated by the Roman cavalry, so that's a very warlike situation, she's never portrayed nor invoked as a war goddess in any of the inscriptions. This may just be because Roman women didn't go to war. They were expected to stay home and take care of their households. The Romans were shocked that Celtic women went into battle. So it's possible that the Epona that has come down to us is a sanitized, reinvented horse goddess tamed for Roman sensibilities. However, I think her portrayal as a motherly protector of horses is an important one, partly because I see horses as representing the natural world and its inherent pre-agricultural sovereignty, but also because my own relationship with Epona seemed to be very much about protecting horses and their grazing lands. Before we bring Macha and Rhiannon in again, we need to define sovereignty. In its original sense, sovereignty is essentially the right to hold and rule over a territory or a country. But how does one get that right? Is it just by being the strongest, or does the right have to be bestowed by some higher power? It seems that the Celts believed that this right to hold and rule land was bestowed by a goddess who was almost synonymous with that land, and so we call them sovereignty goddesses. Not all sovereignty goddesses are horse goddesses, but there seems to have been a strong connection between the ideas of horses and sovereignty in the Celtic worldview. I'll have to save the details on that for another video, though. Since we don't know what Epona's story was, it's difficult to say whether it was similar to the tales of Rhiannon and Macha or completely different. So she might not be a sovereignty goddess in the way that the other two are. Rhiannon has no obvious associations with war. Perhaps that's only because the Mabinogi was written down much later in the medieval period than the tales of Macha. By the 14th century, women in Britain didn't go to war as they had in earlier times. However, it's worth noting that the names Rhiannon, meaning divine queen, and Morrigan, meaning the great queen, pretty similar. So there could be a connection there. The stories of Macha and Rhiannon both have female goddesses choosing mortal men as mates. Krunjek isn't a king, but he is an important landholder, and he's without a mate. Huich is the young unmarried ruler of David when Rhiannon turns up and says she has chosen him. So this can be taken as the goddess of the land choosing the sovereign. In both of these stories, the trajectory for the goddess is not a happy one once she gives birth. Why that should be is worth thinking about, but the answers are not simple ones. So, to finish up, it's possible that these three goddesses grew out of a goddess who belonged to an earlier culture, Celtic or pre-Celtic. But I don't believe that if we traced them back to some proto-horse goddess, we would find a better deity or one that's somehow more pure. We would just find one who's even more distant from our own culture than these three wonderful deities whose identities we do know.